Hello, everyone, and welcome to another recording of our Hopsworks 5-minute interviews. Very happy to be here. I'm Rick van Bruggen from Hopsworks, and on the other side of this Google meeting, I have a wonderful guest that actually is working for a company that we are doing more and more activities with in the US and elsewhere, and that is Charles Frye from Modal. Hi, Charles. How are you?
Hey, Rick. Thanks for having me on.
Fantastic. Thank you for making the time. So Modal, I've heard the name a bunch of times, but maybe our listeners and our viewers haven't. So would you mind kind of introducing Modal and also who you are and what do you do there?
Yeah, I'd love to. So Modal is a serverless infrastructure platform for data, ML, AI teams, whatever you want to call it. Maybe you're old school and call it big data. Maybe you're new school and you call it agents. Whatever you call it. You need flexible infrastructure that makes like scaling up Python workloads, distributing them onto 1 GPU, 8 GPUs, 100 GPUs, straightforward, kind of like an infrastructure as code or infrastructure from code kind of setup so that a data scientist or an ML researcher can actually own their infrastructure and own their deployments more easily. Co-founded by Eric Bernhardson of Spotify and Akshat Bubna, previously at Scale, sort of building the kind of tooling that they found themselves building internally, or they saw other people building internally at large companies over and over and over again. And so my role is I actually was an early user of Modal. Like I look back at the records and I was one of the first 100 users, I think. I found it because I was trying to make like kind of deployable AI demos and ML demos about like a year and a half ago. So actually maybe a little bit more. Just before ChatGPT dropped and the world changed. I was like looking at how can I do better deployment of ML models. And I found myself needing, I was like struggling with 8 different types of YAML files and like the many gotchas of writing Docker files by hand and like permissions and VPCs and AWS. And when I found Modal, it was like a breath of fresh air to be able to deploy stuff myself. And that's actually also around the time that I found out about Hopsworks, because Jim Dowling was also teaching courses about how to deploy ML, which is what I was doing at the time. And he was using Modal along with Hopsworks to make this, to make like an actually maintainable, usable ML pipeline for your like Python data scientist or Python ML researcher persona. So I got promoted from user champion on social media to internal like AI engineer. So you continue to use the platform for crazy AI projects, and then also like developer relations. So get out there, figure out what people are doing with the platform, and help advocate for those uses internally.
Really great. So Jim is actually doing the talk next week, I think, in New York, together with you guys on a meetup. So it's great to see that we're actually, continuing that relationship and in many different ways. And you've kind of answered my question, my second question, which is, how did you get into it? It's basically as a user, right? You kind of got into it because you were scratching your own itch, right?
I think maybe going even further back, I entered the field of machine learning and AI about 10 years ago when I came out to the University of California, Berkeley for a PhD. I actually came in under the banner of neuroscience. I'd been doing neurobiology and psychology experiments. But when I started grad school, I was like, man, this ML thing looks like it's really taking off. Like AlexNet had just had its big success just about a year before. And there had been like continued successes for neural networks. And I was like, well, neural networks has neuro in the name, and it looks like this is going to be a successful technology. So that's what I should study in my PhD, and I could call it a neuroscience PhD because it's neural networks. So that's how I kind of got started, trying to bridge the gap between what computers can do and what brains can do.
Yeah. And is that still, I mean, I always ask people, why do you think this is important? And I guess you're kind of hinting at it already there, because you're helping advance the whole field of knowledge creation and knowledge, understanding knowledge, basically intelligence. Or maybe you can kind of explain it in your own words. Why did you think this is so interesting and important?
I think from the beginning it was that there were all these things that brains can do that computers can't do, which even goes like at the first layer is just perception, right? Like machine perception was like the first thing to tackle. Can a machine tell what's in an image? Can a machine a machine is currently listening to this audio and turning it into text. That's this like machine perception layer.
Yes.
And it seems like obvious that making machines be able to do that is going to be beneficial, because we have to spend a lot of human labor on doing these things. And we are like, it's effortful to have to transcribe a podcast like this. And so that makes it harder to make transcripts. That actually makes podcasts less accessible. It makes it harder to discover podcasts with things that are interesting to you. So like it felt like there was this like huge array of potential applications if we could get this to work. And then we did in fact get it to work over the last decade, much faster than I thought it would be. And so now we've started to unlock all those cases. I think, there's the kind of a big overhang between what's been achieved in research and what's been achieved at like at a demo level and what can actually be turned into products. And we're in this fun and exciting phase now of like productizing that research and productionizing that research. So all the way at the like furthest edge, things like agentic behavior from LLMs, to at the like oldest edge, just plain old computer vision and computer perception of audio. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, I like the fact that you use podcast transcriptions as an example. I remember in 2015, I started a podcast for Neo4j, and I can tell you the transcription was the part that I hated every single time I did it. And yeah, that's become so much easier these days. So, and I'm, just a little tangent here, but I'm kind of thinking that at Modal, you see more and more use cases like that as well, right? So where you're using, generative AI, large language models, those types of use cases, you see them more and more there as well, I assume. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like the goal is to make a very generic infrastructure platform that's just like, serverless computing that is actually good and usable. But the place where we've like seen our initial product market fit, or we've seen something that has really, taken off with a bunch of use cases, is in running inference for mid-size generative models. So something that's on the scale of 1 billion parameters to 13 billion parameters. That's a podcast transcription with Whisper, much smaller than these 13 billion scale models, but still very useful for doing something like transcribing a podcast. And in that case, it's like actually a very parallelizable task. So you can just run it on, run 1 minute at a time on 100 workers. And that means you can finish 100 minutes of transcription in, however long it takes you to transcribe 1 minute. So we've seen a wide array of those things, as well as just like classic ETL, the kind of thing that you might run to create a feature in a feature store, or like cron jobs and like triggered functions, and just hosting a tiny little Python web server. All this stuff, like same basic infrastructure, same core tooling works for it. Just Docker containers that are easy to use, that are fast to spin up, that parallelize effectively.
Fantastic. Hey, Charles, I think people will be intrigued and interested to explore this themselves after hearing about this. But I'm going to wrap up this podcast, this recording here, because we want to keep those short and snappy. And I always ask the same question. What is it that you could share with the community? I'm sure there's lots of Modal resources that you could share, but maybe there's like a book or something else that you thought was super interesting. What would you like to share?
Yeah, I'd say for the Modal side, I work on documentation and examples, and we kind of pride ourselves on the quality of that documentation and examples. We maintain and monitor the quality the way that we do the rest of our software. And so it's documentation examples that actually run, which is a surprisingly high bar. So that's modal.com/docs. So there's some cool examples. There's actually one I wrote when I was still just a user of how to make customized stable diffusion that'll make pictures of your pet. So that's one example. And then more recently, I set up TensorRT LLM, which is a notoriously kind of hard tool to get working. But once you get it working, it can double or triple the throughput of your LLM application. So 2 different little examples there to show off what you can do with Modal. But yeah, at a kind of a higher level, I'd say for AI engineering right now, there aren't a ton of great books to recommend, unfortunately, right? The books have yet to be written. I think Chip Wynn is working on a book on AI engineering. You can maybe get an early access for that on O'Reilly. So right now it's mostly like people are hacking, and you can find out about it on Twitter or Discord. And then there's some events. So maybe I would recommend some events coming up in the month of June. The ML Ops community is having an event on quality assurance for AI. So on like how do you do evals and how do you do continuous integration and continuous deployment for AI applications. I'll be giving a talk there. And then the AI Engineer World's Fair, put out by the Latent Space podcast people, that is also in late June. Both events, I think, are in San Francisco. I'll do a little workshop at that. That's sort of technical nitty-gritty details on AI engineering. And then there's also going to be lots of people giving talks. And the last AI Engineer Summit had a ton of really incredible talks and a lot of great people to meet and swap tips with. So those would be my recommendations.
Fantastic. We will put some links to those events in the transcription. And in any case, I'd love to thank you so much for taking the time to do this recording. It's been a lot of fun and really interesting. So thank you so much, and I wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks for having me, Rick.